crisis and the demands for food that go along with that as well. The funding landscape for trying to tackle some of these problems looks quite different now than what it did before the pandemic, both in terms of what funders are prioritizing and in terms of the available funding opportunities. So today we're here to discuss this with people representing 3 of the organizations in the Chicago region that are supporting food system work. And we're going to have a really great conversation. I hope these are 3 people that are some of the most sort of thoughtful people that I've had the pleasure of working with in the food system and in the funding space generally. So we're going to have a really great conversation. My name is Jack Westwood. I'm the Program Director for Environmental Sustainability at Walder Foundation. We are a family foundation based in the Chicago region in Skokie. And the environmental sustainability portfolio includes some food system work, including through the Chicago Region Food System Fund. On our panel this evening, we're thrilled to be joined by Jose Oliva. Jose is the campaigns director at Heal Food Alliance and also co-chair of the Chicago Region Food System Fund. We're also joined by Lenore Bayer, who is the Director of Conservation Initiatives at Kinship Foundation, where she manages the Food Land Opportunity Program, or sometimes known as FLOW. Lenore is also, with Jose, the co-chair of the Chicago Region Food System Fund. And finally, we're joined by Courtney Renton, who is Executive Director of Proofing Station. This is a fairly new organization in Chicago, and we're looking forward to hearing more about that. But just briefly, it's an impact-first investment fund focused on investing integrated capital in entities operating across all sectors in the food and agriculture supply chain. I'd also encourage you, as our audience here this evening, if you'd like to pop your name in the chat with your organization, if you're representing an organization or where you're dialing in from this evening, that would be great and give us a sense of who's in the virtual room with us today. I see we're getting popped up on the screen here as I talk, which is great. I'll just pause a second until we're all there. I think that's it. We hope this to be a fairly interactive session, so please do use the chat for comments and questions. We're hoping that this session will really cover these big picture issues in the food and agriculture systems. We have fairly limited time. The food system, as we know, is big and complex. And given our limited time and out of respect to other members of the audience, we ask that any comments are sort of kept at that high level and sort of a no pitch zone. I would say in terms of not going to too much detail about your own specific work, and which we can follow up on at a later date if needed. So thank you for respecting that. I also have colleagues, Brandon Hayes and Vanessa Reese, who will be monitoring the chat and may pop in from time to time with anything in the chat that we should discuss. So with that, let's get started. So Jose, I wanted to start the conversation with you. You're someone so deeply involved in the food system on the non-profit side through your work with HEAL, and now also for the last couple of years on the funder side in your role as co-chair of the Chicago Region Food System Fund. Could you get us started with just talking a little bit about what your vision of the ideal future food system looks like, and what should we be aiming for here?
Yeah, thanks, Jack, for the soft pitch. I appreciate it. I first of all actually want to thank everyone who made time this evening to join this session, and of course the folks from CIFPAC for all the hard work. I know what it's like to put together a webinar, so this might be about 10 times the amount of work. So thank you for all of that. I want to start really quickly before I answer your question. I promise I'm not going to take more than 5 minutes, but I want to start really quickly with just a little bit of the origin story from my perspective, which of course is different for every person, right? Every group thinks of things differently. So for me, or for HEAL, I should say, the Chicago Region Food System Fund was something that we were looking at during the pandemic as a really fertile ground, no pun intended, for experimentation and for understanding how the food system could be changed in the process of this huge opportunity. You know, the pandemic was a horrible tragedy, but it also created it did one really good thing, which is that it lifted the veil from the food system, right? And suddenly everyone knew what the steps were for the food to get to our plates, and that there were people along in every single one of those steps, right? And that those people were essential workers, but they were being paid minimum wage, oftentimes not even minimum wage. And so that allowed us, that reality allowed us to see how philanthropy could play a role in the transformation of the food system in a way that would be positive, right? Not good old philanthropy funding, you know, their friends, right? But basically looking at the real needs in the community and funding that. And that was the origin of HEAL's involvement with the Chicago Region Food System Fund. The fund moved really quick, and I'm really proud to say this. It moved really quick to actually bring community members into decision-making roles. So much so that now community members make the majority of the steering committee for the fund, making decisions, not just on who is going to be funded, which is actually really important, right? But they're also making decisions on what the fund's future is going to look like, right? And how we are organized and designed to actually serve the community. And so, and that's unique. I want to repeat that because there are a lot of foundations and a lot of them are doing great work, and a lot of joint funds also are doing great work. But there is none other as democratic or as participatory as the Chicago Region Food System Fund, in my experience. There might be others that I just don't know about, but at least the ones that I know of, this is the shining example of how to do it. And then I do think it's important to not get stuck in praising ourselves and saying, oh, we did a great job of bringing community folks together. We are always looking to grow. And I want to throw this out to our audience here, that if you think there's a better way of doing it, or not a better way, but just if you think that we should do a specific thing in the fund to make it more democratic, to make it more participatory, to ensure that voices from the community are being heard, we want to hear. We want you to tell us what those ideas are, because that is going to inform the future for the fund. And I'm going to leave it at that. It's like 5 minutes, so that's about right. And I'll hand it right back to you, Jack. Thank you.
Thanks, Jose. So can I just follow up quickly on that? And the fund has come a long way since it started, and it is doing some good things. But what are the things that it's trying to achieve? What is this sort of ideal vision of the future food system that I've heard you talk so articulately about that so many times, and wondered if you could share that with our audience here.
Yes. Yeah, I didn't answer your original question, right? Yeah, I mean, we're probably not going to get there in the next decade, and the Chicago Region Food System Fund is probably not going to be the funder that's going to make it happen. But I think we are in a position to actually create the momentum for this, right? And that food system is a food system that is nourishing to communities and workers, right? So people are able to get the culturally appropriate food that they need without exploitation or extraction, right? So we're not destroying the earth or the environment, and certainly not creating climate change as a result. And we're also not exploiting human beings, right? We're not getting cheap food on the backs of minimum wage workers, right? So we are in control of our own food system at the community level, and we are the ones who are deciding what is it that we need to grow, how do we process it, who gets what share of it. That all gets decided at the community level. And I don't think that that's that radical, right? I mean, it's definitely something that is not, I think, understood by the mainstream, but it isn't an extreme departure from what we already have, right? What it does is it just democratizes the institutions that we currently have, and it removes the exploitative and extractive nature of the larger corporations that are involved in our food system currently.
Great, thanks, Jose. I like the word nourishing that you used there. I think that's that's a really good way of thinking about it. And so for our audience here, I was just wondering, how you all are thinking about your visions of the system, and maybe you could pop in the chat just a word or two on, literally one word or two words, on how you think of your ideal version of the future of the food system. And as we're going through the panel, we can perhaps reflect on some of those things in the chat. Lenore, I'd like to move over to you. Foodland Opportunity has now been around for 10 years, I think. Which obviously encompasses this period of the last few years that have been pretty tumultuous. How have the challenges that we've experienced in those last few years shaped your thinking and shaped Foodland Opportunity's thinking about the system? And has that changed your goals in your work in any way?
Thanks, Jack. I think, yes, this is our 10-year anniversary. So we've been around since 2014. And originally, Foodland Opportunity was created to create a resilient local food economy was the goal, right? And if I had to look back at the grants that we did in 2014 versus what we are doing now, I think there's been a lot of adjustments. We've had to really look at what is happening currently in the food movement and on how our needs and changes are evolving. So that has been also looking at the people and the people that are now involved in the local food movement. So our strategies around land access and building skills of both farmers and food entrepreneurs, and also attracting capital to the system, are still relevant. We haven't solved that in 10 years. And like Jose says, it's not even going to be solved in 10 more. But the way we have addressed those have shifted. So first of all, the leadership of all these organizations has shifted. There's more women, more people of color running the organizations and serving a wide variety of people. Equity is an issue that we're looking at across all levels of the system, from farm to fork. Climate and how that's impacting growers, and where we're going to look at the infrastructure needs that are associated with that. And capital needs, just the regional infrastructure needed to take what's grown out on the farm get to people who want to eat it, which is throughout our region, and really recognizing that there's a lot of things in that infrastructure that just aren't there. Policy and also, I think we've seen, and this has been a goal of Flow from the beginning, to encourage collaboration and defragmentation that we really saw 10 years ago. And the number of networks, the number of groups working together, the number of groups kind of sharing knowledge and seeing how they can avoid being duplicative, but also provide more value to the system, has really changed in the last 10 years. So I think that's a result of all these different things that we've been dealing with.
Great, thanks, Lenore. Courtney, proofing station's kind of new. a pretty new organization in the Chicago region, working in this space. You're seeking to fulfill a pretty unique role that's not, covered by Chicago Region Food System Fund or by Food Land Opportunity or many of the other funders working in this space. We can get more into the specifics on this later, but could you just give us the sort of the high level summary of what Proofing Station is all about and how it fits into this vision of the future food system?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Great to be here with all of you tonight and with Jose and Lenore and Jack, who I've learned so much from. I think given that we're all here spending our dinner hour together on Zoom tonight, I'm guessing that we all share a certain vision of a food system that's more equitable and sustainable and resilient. And that's really why Proofing Station was formed in 2023. So, we are the new kids on the block in many ways, but we're really building on the work and the progress that Jose and Lenore have already spoken about in this sort of post-pandemic landscape in the philanthropic world too. We just launched last year, but the project has really been the culmination of years of research and conversations about funding gaps in the food system, which I'm sure I'll talk more about throughout the night. But, people like Lenore and others, I think, saw that there were these systemic and persistent challenges in the food system, especially for food businesses. So, farmers, food businesses, the people that we've already mentioned who process, produce, distribute, sell food in the Midwest, facing challenges to accessing funding and financing. And I think also that there were these large scale challenges in the food system, like access to land or regional infrastructure that maybe philanthropic funding was struggling to move the needle on, especially since grants can't typically be made to for-profit businesses, and those are key players in our food system as well. So that's, I think, kind of the genesis of Proofing Station. We are, as you mentioned, a newly launched nonprofit impact investing fund, and our goal is really to increase access to capital to advance equity and sustainability in the Midwest. Our inaugural fund is focused on the Midwest region, so Chicago, but also 6 states in the upper Midwest, and our goal is to deploy $25 million over the next 10 years into some key market gaps that will really advance sustainability, social and racial equity, and economic resilience in the region. We are just about to announce our first investments. So, we've been around a couple months, but we're really excited to start getting that capital out into the system.
That's great. Thanks, Courtney. It's really interesting, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. But how there's these, not just the organizations represented here, but there's a number of different entities trying to support this work in the food system, all trying to they all each have their own mission and their goals, and really trying to work on that. But I'd like us to think maybe a little bit later on how these different funding mechanisms and funding vehicles sort of complement each other and can work together. So we'll get to that perhaps a little bit later. Just looking at the chat, we've got a couple of suggestions that the ideal future system is based in reciprocity, which I really like, and one that is abundant as well. And I'm keen to hear more ideas there as well. So if you would like to contribute in that way, then please go ahead. Lenore, so FLOW, Food Land Opportunity, is sort of the longest standing initiative that's represented here. What role do you see yourself playing, or have you played, in building a more equitable and resilient food system? And do you think your approach is working?
I hope so. FLOW has given out over $36 million over the 10 years to a variety of different organizations, and expanded around looking at our key strategies, but also looking at our larger issues of conservation and economic development, and really building wealth in communities and how we can do that. So we've continued to shift and experiment with different funding models, some of that being the grant making made through FLOW, and also to make sure that we can really get resources where we can make an impact. So is that through working with organizations who do regranting? Is it being part of funder collaboratives? Is it being a key player in the Chicago Region Food System Fund and seeing how that different sorts of grants and different sizes of grants can get out to different organizations who are operating at different scales, from both the neighborhood model all the way up to the regional model, which we really feel is important, and supporting Proofing Station to say, okay, this is a place where investment dollars can also make a significant difference in a different way than grant making. So I think we continue to adjust and evaluate and keep track of that. Like you said earlier, I think we're definitely open to feedback and interest in what the community thinks is working and what isn't, especially as we go into our next phase of food land opportunity, and really looking at how some of this shifting work and how people are doing it on the ground can be better resourced and better funded. So I think that there's opportunities and there's things that are working, but I'm sure there are things that aren't too. But using different funding models, recognizing that everything it's not a one size fits all, and the local food movement keeps changing every day. So we need to kind of keep shifting that perspective.
And has pursuing those different types of funding models, has that been sort of responsive to different kinds of challenges that you've seen, or is that been a more sort of proactive way of saying, okay, we've done some grant making, that's worked well, now let's try this and see what happens?
I would say it's a little bit of both. We're willing to take some risks and do some things. Many people might be familiar with the prize competition that we did a number of years ago. That, you know, it was fun and a good model then, but it's probably not the best thing to do right now. Do we really want to create competition, or do we want to create things where people are really working together and collaborating moving forward? So, you know, that was a little bit of a, we're going to try this and see how it works, and see who we can attract to the system and how we can make sure resources get out. But maybe we should also go, did that work, or did it have different unintended consequences, should I say? So I think that there's things too that funders always need to be aware of. I think in working in collaboration with other funders also allows us to kind of expand beyond what we might consider our guidelines and go to a higher level of different types of things, and also to reach down also to the very grassroots practitioner community-based organizations as well, and do that different form of outreach. So it's a journey, right, for everybody to keep learning and keep moving.
Absolutely. I think that's the most important thing, isn't it? That we continue to learn and continue to, you know, respond to these challenges and learn from the communities that, you know, we're all trying to support. Just a quick one on collaboratives, and that's, you know, evolving from, you know, food land opportunity as an initiative that has, you know, sort of a single foundation, sort of as it were, to being involved in some of these funding collaboratives. What are some of the, you know, for any other funders out there, I suppose, or anyone thinking about joining a funding collaborative, what are the main sort of values that you get from it? What's the value proposition, I suppose, from a funding collaborative for you?
For me, it's learning about what other people, I mean, because different funders focus more in on different areas. So some are working more in health, or working more in food and economic development, or those types of things, and really learning from that and that experience, but also how projects are evaluated and how it opens up the doors to lots of different perspectives that might not be as readily available when you're dealing within a smaller defined set of things that you think you're able to fund. So it really kind of pushes those things and pushes out the and also allows that combined money coming together to do more and make it go farther, leverage. Yeah,
that's great. That's certainly, you know, as a participant in the Chicago Region Food System Fund, I think, you know, Walder Foundation has certainly gained those kinds of values from it as well, and it allows us to fund the system, in a way that we wouldn't be able to do, on our own. So I've certainly found it to be very powerful as well. Jose, so as we talked about earlier, the fund, began in about April 2020 as a response to the pandemic. And the pandemic, as you mentioned, sort of lifted the veil a little bit on the food system, but also sort of exacerbated some of the inequities and injustices that exist in the food system. That things perhaps got well, things for sure got worse in some ways, but really like put a spotlight on those things in ways that may not have come to light, I suppose, in that way otherwise. What are the some of the key principles and values that the fund seeks to sort of put forth and guide its sort of operation?
Yeah, so Lenore mentioned a couple of them, and I think I'll double down on those. I think equity is a big one, right? And that the key to equity is that we're not really just looking at BIPOC-owned businesses or BIPOC-owned farms, et cetera, or women-owned farms, or farm businesses in general that are owned by folks who have been marginalized. But we're also looking at the humans in the food system as a whole, right? That does include workers, which I know everybody on this call probably knows that's what I'm all about. But it also includes people who live in communities and just eat the food, right? So that includes the kids at CPS. It includes the teachers at CPS. It includes all of the human beings that have anything to do with that food. So that's what equity means to me, right? It's not just about one group of people or about one sector. It's really about the entire food system and the human beings that are involved in the food system at every single point. And then the other thing that I think is really critical, and I think we're trying really hard at the Chicago Region Food System Fund to lift this principle up, which is democracy and participation. It is really impossible to show up to a community and say, hey, here's what you need, I got it, and you can have it, right? I mean, obviously no one is going to turn down money, but the community, usually funders will come up with an RFP, right? And the RFP is a request for proposals, and the request for proposals has specific parameters that the funder comes up with. At the Chicago Region Food System Fund, it's the community that's coming up with those parameters, right? It's folks who are practicing the art of creating equity in the food system that are actually developing those parameters for other folks, right? For other people who are not on the steering committee, right? There's limited spaces on the steering committee. And by the way, that's another thing, right? The steering committee has made a commitment and behaves in this way that I've seldom seen anywhere else, which is really movement oriented. If they're not thinking about how do we get money for my organization, right? Or how do I position, how do I jockey myself so that I'm rubbing elbows with these funders and getting as much money from them as possible. They're really thinking not just beyond their organization, but beyond their sector, right? We have folks who are farmers on there, right? And then we also have folks like myself, who's a worker organizer, right? And we see eye to eye. We see beyond just that specific sector that we're in to actually inform how these values can permeate the entire food system.
Thanks, Jose. And I think the values, which you talked about have really guided some of the evolution of the fund, since it started. This idea of the community-based steering committee, I think, is quite unique, at least in my experience in philanthropy. Could you give us just a little insight into how that's working and kind of how that operates?
Yeah, sure. And Lenore, feel free to jump in. It's actually a really beautiful experiment in so many ways. We started off with a group of people who didn't know each other. There were a couple of us that knew most of the people there, but the majority of the community members didn't know each other. They didn't know the funders, but they might know one of the funders that invited them or whatever, but they didn't know the group. So the first few months, I would say, is that right, Lenore? Would you say more than a few months? The beginning of the fund life, it was really all of us getting to know each other and developing that really deep relationship that is necessary in order to connect trust. I know this is a corny saying, but in the movement, everything has to move at the speed of trust. And if people don't trust each other, what ends up happening is that there's usually, and I've seen this in other experiments, there's usually misgivings about what's that person's real agenda, right? Why are they really here? And that is the beginning. That could be so corrosive, right? But that really is the beginning of the end of trust for that experiment. So we took a long time. We took a few months at the beginning of the whole thing to just socialize each other to ourselves, to our work. We did presentations about our work to each other. And then we moved beyond that to doing actual grant making, right? And we did it with a very intentional sort of sink or swim attitude. and folks really shined, right? There were moments where people had to review up to 30 grants in one sitting, right? And they did it, and it was beautiful to see how people would reach out to each other and talk to each other. Do you know this organization? Do you know what they do? And this sort of cross pollination that was happening was just amazing. Much more, I think, I don't know for sure because I've never been a real funder. But I think it's probably richer than what happens in the office of a program officer.
I think that's absolutely right. Just before we move on to Courtney to hear a bit more about Proofing Station, there's a question in the chat which I think relates to this, the grant making process that the fund has adopted, and it's from Chuck Wolf, and he asks, the Chicago Region Food System Fund has spread money around to many organizations instead of making 7-figure grants to accomplish some major outcomes like building a grocery store, for example. Did the fund consider making fewer but larger grants, which might be more impactful? And what was the thought process around that? So Lenore or Jose, would you like to speak to that?
I can start, and then Lenore, if you don't mind, you can jump in. Hi, Chuck. So yes, we had a very lively discussion about grant sizes with a facilitator that came and led our strategic planning for the year 2022 to 2023. My brain's just not what it used to be. And part of, I think, why we landed on smaller grants, Chuck, is because there was a sense from folks that make up the steering committee that there were too many issues, too many community needs in too many communities to focus in on one thing, one project. It was a pretty intentional decision, I think, on our part, not that we had the conversation about funding one grocery store, right? But the intentionality was to make sure that we were responding to needs that were coming to us from community rather than us coming up with an idea and implementing it. I don't know, Lenore, if I'm saying lies.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head here. I think it really is designed to be responsive to the community, to look forward, to create that, but also to make sure that we're reaching out to all different corners of the community as well. And we really felt like that this group was continuing to learn and make those decisions, and there wasn't some one key issue that we thought would be a bunch of money that should be targeted.
That being said, though, we did set aside a little bit of money for what we're calling experimentation. And that is something that we, you know, Chuck, if you want to jump into to help us design that, we're open to ideas, but the crux of that money is really about kind of what you said, Chuck. Like, well, how do we think creatively, especially from the community side of things, about how we can use this money so that it is having an impact, but it's not something that has been true and tried, right? Like, we can experiment and see if it flies.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Chuck, for the question as well. I think that's been a point of evolution in some ways of the fund as well. When I think back to the very first grants that were made by the fund, they were sort of bigger, sort of re-granting, just to kind of get money out and be responsive, you know, to the immediate crisis. But over time, you know, I think the fund has evolved to rather than doing these re-granting sort of operations, is moving money directly to the organizations on the ground. Courtney, let's talk a little bit more about proofing station and impact investing. There's, you know, when you look around at the impact investing sort of landscape as it relates to the food system, you know, there seems to be, you know, no real shortage of ag focused, you know, venture capital and impact investors out there. So could you talk a little bit more about why is proofing station needed, and what is the gap that you're specifically trying to fill?
Sure, yeah. I get that perception, and I think it's, you know, true, but I'd also argue that those funds aren't reaching everyone or solving many of the issues that we're all talking about today. You know, I really think of proofing station and the kinds of flexible funding that we can offer as another tool that's in our collective toolbox for creating the change that we're all talking about. I think it's really about matching the right funding to the right needs, and then also leveraging that capital to increase in the system overall. You know, and when you ask why is proofing station needed, my first reaction is sort of personal. You know, this is my first transition, I think, into the funding side of things. I also have run and worked in nonprofits for the last 15 years and really been on the other side of seeking funding or supporting others who are seeking funding, and seen the financial barriers to creating change at scale. And so that's really what motivated and attracted me to proofing station, was to think about what are new tools that we have to deploy to create the change that we want. I saw someone put the word abundant in the chat, which is one of my favorite ways to think about the future food system. And for me, that's I really believe that increasing equitable access to capital is a literal form of abundance, and another, you know, tool that we all have to create that food system we envision. You know, I think proofing station, our goal is not to be duplicative of any of the other funders that are out there doing great work, or other VCs or investors, or even banks and traditional lenders. We really were designed to be an additive player in that pipeline, and to fill gaps, and to fund things and people and projects and communities that were otherwise, you know, struggling to access funding. I think it comes down to proofing station structure as well, which is quite unique and allows us to be really flexible and creative, and to take on, you know, some investments that might otherwise be perceived as quote unquote risky. I'm going to put that in quotes, especially maybe from traditional lending perspective. So, both in the way that we receive donations and investments from our investors who are really bought into the mission of Proofing Station and are looking for their return to be impact versus dollars. And then also, I think in the structure of how we deploy funding out into the system, our goal is to really be able to touch some of these places and communities that have otherwise, been left behind or sometimes systemically excluded or discriminated against when we talk about land access and land tenure in this country. So, again, I think our goal is really to be creative, to demonstrate that new models are possible in terms of who we fund and how we fund. And ensure that capital is flowing to communities and people and businesses who maybe have been left out of traditional funding structures in the past.
It's interesting you talk about sort of risk and return, and we were talking a little bit about this earlier, but could you talk a little bit about the philosophy in Proofing Station about how you think of risk and return, and how do you manage expectations of the funders of Proofing Station with regard to that as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. We actually just had an investment committee meeting earlier today where we were talking about this and, making sure that our internal models and structures and processes are reflecting the sort of philosophical definition of risk that we want to bring to our work and not kind of falling back on, industry norms and best practices if we're trying to do something different. And that's really hard sometimes. I think we're really lucky to have founding funders who were there for the birth of Proofing Station, including Flo, who kind of saw the gap, saw the need from the beginning, and were willing to invest in that mission and vision. Our goal is really capital preservation across the fund so that we're we're not offering returns in the way that some of the other impact investors that you might have been referencing, Jack, who are kind of looking for the to do good and to make money in the process. That's great. I think that's not our model. And so we, we're looking to preserve capital across the portfolio, which also allows us, I think, to take on different levels of risk within and across all of our investments.
Yeah, it's a big, complicated system or complex system, I should say, and there's room for a lot of different players in it. And I think whilst there are room for a lot of different players, that does leave these gaps. And so organizations, I think, like Proofing Station, it's great that being able to spot that gap and really try and address those barriers.
Yeah. Can I add one thing, Jack?
Yes, please.
I think another one of our goals, not only in who we're funding and how we're funding, is really to be what we call a demonstration fund. And so we keep hearing from everyone that we're working with and other funds in the space that what we're doing is pretty unique. And so our goal is to be really open about that also and share our learnings back out with, peers and networks like this. So, I think we're excited to, once we start making those investments and have lessons learned, we really want to be able to share that back out so that more funders can adopt these models as well. And then this might not be so unique in a few years, which is our goal.
Yeah, that's great. Someone called Jose Oliva in the chat asks whether you have a filter or parameter for labor in your investments and how you're thinking about that.
That is a very good question. I don't have our screening criteria up in front of me at the exact moment, but I'd love to talk to you about that, Jose. I think we'll get into some of our focus areas later, which, have to do with these kind of, maybe I'll just do them now. Is that okay, Jack, if I jump?
Go ahead. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So our 4 key focus areas that were identified through all this research of kind of gaps needed in the system are engaging excluded market players. So investing in, food businesses and farms that are owned or operated by marginalized food systems participants, which can include Black, Indigenous people of color, women owned operators, unconventional farming operators. I know the USDA also has their own definitions of underinvested farmers. I think that's probably the focus area, Jose, that would be most aligned with your question, but would love your thoughts about how we might incorporate that as a screening criteria. And then our other three focus areas are access to land and real assets. So I'm sure all of us here know how difficult it is to access land. And so that's a big one for us. Expanding regional infrastructure as well. So if we think about kind of the goal to diversify crops in the Midwest food system away from corn and soy, understanding that there is also going to be supply chain infrastructure that needs to be invested in along the way. And then our fourth focus area is advancing sustainable cultivation. So thinking really about that transition to organic and regenerative farming practices and the cost associated with doing that. So helping to kind of de-risk that transition for farmers. Yeah, so our current screening criteria are all kind of built around those four focus areas and making sure that each investment that we're considering is hitting at least one, if not multiple of those areas.
Great, thanks, Courtney. Jose, where's the fund going? Like, where do you see? That's a big question. So, what directions would you like to see it go in, and how do you think it can further evolve? And maybe framing that around any sort of emerging issues that you're seeing here in the Chicago region.
Absolutely.
Like, go ahead.
Oh, is my internet on? Can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you. Can you hear us?
I'm going to turn off. I'm going to turn off my video and see if this works.
Okay, can you still hear us, Jose?
If you can't hear me, can you please just give me a... You're breaking up a little bit. Hello? Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yeah.
All right, perfect. Let me try to answer that question. It is a huge question. I think there is a real first of all, there's a need in every community for real food, right? And when I say real food, I'm really referring to food that contains those 5 GFPP value categories, right? Of humane and environmentally sustainable and labor friendly, and also that builds the local economy, and that is nutritious and nutrient dense, right? So if we focus on those 5 value categories and we say that's what we want our food to reflect, right, our values, I can see the Chicago Region Food System Fund growing to develop food systems, not one food system, but several food systems that actually have those 5 value categories embedded in them, and that they become sort of the example of, yeah, we can do it. There is no reason why not, right? And so I love that idea, right? I think there is potential for that. I hope that there's going to be funders who are excited by creating not just that, but also a more, participatory way of getting funds to people who are in communities. So that's my short answer. I think there's probably a much more refined version of that answer that if I had more time, I could give you.
Thanks, Jose. Just looking back at the chat here, and Emmy Brawley had mentioned cherished as her word for an ideal future food system, which I think is really, really nice. That's something that, I think the food system is clearly often taken for granted, and many people don't sort of give it a second thought. So I think the idea of a system that is cherished by all and that works for all, I think is really great. So thanks for that, Emmy. Just in thinking about the future of what the future looks like for these different funding vehicles and collaborative funds, just curious for everyone on the call in the audience, whether you have ideas about types of work or issue areas or parts of the food system that that still remain underfunded and need more attention, we'd be definitely keen to hear hear your ideas about that in the chat for sure. So please go ahead and type away, and we'll we can chat about anything that comes up there. So the theme of the CIFPAC conference here this week is climate resilience. There are clearly numerous ways that the food system and climate intersect, and many efforts underway that both to reduce the food system's impact on climate change, but also to help the food system be part of the solution in reducing its carbon production, but importantly in helping us to adapt to climate change as well. And I think particularly in regards to urban agriculture, that's a really key part of the equation is how can we use spaces in the urban environment for food production that helps to build a more resilient city. Regenerative agriculture is something that we're hearing a lot about in the last few years. That's really taken off, and Wilder Foundation, we've been fortunate to be involved in some of that work down at the University of Illinois and helping to support that along with Foodland Opportunity and some other funders as well. And that work's really been framed around trying to build the science behind regenerative agriculture, making sure what we're doing in that space is really evidence-based. Really helping the university, big institution, think differently about agriculture and think differently about the land that it has, about its farmland, but also to harness the sort of the educational value of the university and harness extension as well, and help move these ideas about regenerative agriculture out into practice. Lenore, you're someone, you've worked both in the conservation space and in the local food system space. So how do those things intersect for you and for Foodland Opportunity?
So Foodland Opportunity is based in conservation, right? It's one of the main ways that Kinship Foundation and Foodland Opportunity actually supports our conservation goals. And I think this is in the connection between natural resource protection and growing food for people, because they're not really, they shouldn't work against each other. They should work in concert. And so there's a lot of support that we look to supporting how the land is cared for. So issues around soil quality or enhancing soil quality and protecting water and water quality as being how our practices on the land, what's being done, what's the transition from more conventional farming practices into things that actually go back to how things were done before even, so that those things can go in partnership. Also working with the conservation community to really understand that this is something that this sort of land protection for farms is really good for the natural resources that are also in the same spaces all around our region. So that I see that we're seeing practitioners doing amazing things on the land, recognizing the quality of that land to grow food. Can connect to everybody in the community, right? So high nutrient density, good quality, culturally relevant food grown on spaces that also protect wildlife habitat, protect soils, and protect water, are all things that benefit everyone. So I think that those are things that we're seeing as climate changes and shifts. We're looking at longer growing seasons. We're looking at all these different things. We're looking at this area as one of the best places for the best soil in the world. So we should be using it for that purpose, for food, for natural resources, and for making sure it's nourishing everyone.
Well said. Speaking of the region, Proofing Station has a slightly different geography to just the Chicago region. Its focused area is the upper Midwest, so which includes Chicago. But Courtney, why is that regional focus important?
Yeah, everything Lenore just said, first of all, but I'm an environmental manager by training. So I think, again, this intersection is really important to me, and thinking about food systems as ecosystems that don't neatly fall within borders. I also think regional food systems are a really fascinating, kind of powerful lab to test and scale innovation nationally. I think we see that across the country. I am back home in Chicago, but was out on the East Coast for a few years, and learned a lot, being in kind of the Hudson Valley, upper New England regional food system. I think there's so much we can share and learn at that ecosystem level. But all of us who are here know the Midwest is incredibly special, especially when it comes to food and farming, for all the reasons Lenore listed. We're really this home of kind of abundance and natural resources, and have this legacy as America's breadbasket. But I think we also all know that there's this pressing and urgent need with climate change, to diversify the food system in the Midwest, both its people and its production. We have the vast majority of our agricultural land in corn and soy. Chicago and major cities in the region are importing most of their food. I think the stat for Illinois is something like 94%. So I think there's such an opportunity to drive change at the regional level, which of course will influence and be influenced by, Chicago as the Chicago food shed. Our proofing station's geographic focus is what we call the upper Midwest. So we're looking at Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And I think the other thing I would just add to this conversation that I feel really passionate about is, I think farmers can kind of get caught in the middle of this conversation around climate change and agriculture. Is thought about separately, or maybe as emitters, or demonized even as contributing to climate change, or maybe not conservation-minded people, especially in the Midwest. I've spent time on the coast, and I think that's a perception that can exist of our region. But I really think it's the opposite ethos, and the more that we can sort of engage and invest in farmers as stewards of the land and people who care so deeply about these places that they're protecting and caring for every day. And also understanding there are expenses and risks that go along with farmers adopting some of these practices that we know are good for climate and soil health. And so I think that's a role that, financing, whether that's proofing station, traditional financing, crop insurance, there's all these mechanisms in the system, but how can we be leveraging those towards, climate positive, soil positive, water positive, pollination positive outcomes for the food system at the regional level too.
Thanks, Courtney. I think that idea of co-benefits is really, really important, and I think that's how you can get a lot of this to scale, is by really considering what the co-benefits are, as well. Just a couple of comments from the chat here. Jennifer Nelson mentioned some needs where infrastructure and logistics for upcycling, canning, freezing, etc. To provide local food year-round. I think that's a great example of how these, different funds that are represented here can work together. I know, for example, in the Chicago Region Food System Fund, we have supported some infrastructure type projects, but Chicago Region Food System Fund on its own can never get that kind of thing to scale, and that's something that proofing station and beyond, can help with. So I think that's a really, really nice example. I think this one is for Jose. I think that Peter Nicholson, hi Peter, mentions that philanthropy can be influential, but are we overlooking the connection to and the power of the private sector to drive change around many of these topics? It seems like that hasn't been considered. So Jose, what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think that's a really good question, and we have considered it. I think part of the goal and the idea of creating a food system that is both resilient and that is also responding to the needs of community, I think, is that if we are creating private sector entities that are connected to the community, that they are values driven. So it's Jack and Courtney's term of co-benefits, right? Like we have benefits to the health of people in the community, the environment, the animals that are being raised, obviously the people who are eating the food, and of course, labor, right? The people who are growing the food, transporting the food, prepping the food, serving the food, all that. So I think that's part of the consideration in when we talk about, you know, the perfect food system or the growing food system. Now, I know your question is more about the existing private sector, not necessarily the emerging private sector that we're trying to create. And I do think there's also a huge need to make sure that the folks who are committed to these values in the private sector are both investing in the places and in the right ways for communities to develop their food systems, right? And so I'm not sure which sector of the private sector you represent or you are thinking about, but for instance, the program merger that was just blocked, I think is great because that is the kind of thing that we are going to see. We would see prices raised, and we would see communities have grocery stores closing and communities. I mean, it has all of these effects downstream, right? And so that's the kind of thing I think the private sector has to be proactive in those kinds of debates, right? And not be perceived as always wanting to just put profit ahead of everything, right? And as long as that is happening, I think you are welcome at the table, right? And the conversation is a friendly conversation about how do we make the system better, not how do we get rid of the private sector.
Thank you, Jose. I think we have time for just about one more question here, and we have one from Jolie Krasinski, who's asking, are there additional funders we would like to attract to this space and these different collaboratives? Perhaps funders that are focused on, I think the answer is yes, but perhaps of the different sectors. Jolie mentions human health here, perhaps funders involved in that space that aren't necessarily food funders that we would like to attract. So if anyone would like to jump in on thoughts on that. Lenore.
Anyone? Okay, yes.
Yeah.
I think the answer is yes. I think that they're recognizing that food is critical to all kinds of needs across this, that it can I mean, we're trying to talk about the Chicago Region Food System Fund to the grant makers in health, because this is, that if health funders are only looking at one specific disease or looking at one specific research topic or something, they're not really seeing the impacts of health and nutrition on the wider community. And that happening from eating and having available good food. So yes, I think that there's definitely some crossover in attracting. I know Chicago Region Food System Fund is definitely going to be out some more, and so is proofing stations. So I think that there's lots of opportunities to help bring people in, recognizing from all of you, all the great work that's happening in the Chicago and the Midwest region, helping some of the national funders or the funders on the East Coast or the West Coast to really see that in the Midwest, this is where we're going to help solve all these issues, from climate change to labor to everything, and they should be helping us work on it here in Chicago.
That's great. Thanks, Lenore. I think we have to leave it there. That's been a really rich and interesting discussion, and I certainly have lots more questions that I'm sure everybody else does as well. But thank you, Courtney, Jose, and Lenore. Really appreciate your candor and your expertise. And I'll hand it back to Roger.
Great, thank you, Jack, and Courtney, Lenore, and Jose, and also to Katya for a wonderful diagram. We'll make sure this is up and available for folks in the next day or so. Also to our translators and our captioners, for all the team that's been able to pull this together. I'm dropping a quick feedback poll. It just takes half a minute to fill out. It'd be really great to get some feedback on the session, the plan for next year. Here we go. And as people are finishing it up and wrapping it, feel free to sign out, but really thankful again for everybody's engagement today. Tomorrow morning, we start back at 10, another full day of sessions that go into the early evening. And then Friday morning, we'll be at the South Shore Cultural Center from 10 to 3 p.m. So hopefully we'll see some folks, some of you all in person as well, and not just in the virtual universe. All right. Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
Okay, good night.